much too complex, much too complex, too complex, too complex, too complex.
Good afternoon. My name is James K. Holder II. Some of you may know me as Sir James II. I'd like to welcome you back to Not on My Watch. As always, I'd like to ask you to subscribe, like, comment, and share. I want you to retweet this and repeat this. If you are watching, today is Friday, February 2nd, 2018, and I would like to welcome you to a happy and festive, wonderful Black History Month. Now, this is the first episode of Season 3 of Not on My Watch, so thank you for being a continued viewer of the show. One thing that happened this week that was pretty significant and big was the State of the Union address with President Donald Trump. This is an event that I did not watch. I tried to watch about the first 10 minutes of it, and I realized very early on that there's kind of no point. It kind of goes back to what Maxine Waters said, which is, why would I sit and listen to a liar, someone who basically changes what they say like they changed their drawers, hopefully. He just can't really be trusted or fact-checked in any meaningful way, and I didn't possess the mental fortitude to sit and actually, in real time, fact-check his statements for myself. At some point, watching him is kind of like falling into quicksand, because you want to believe that what he's saying is true, and so you ultimately just start falling for things that you know aren't really the case. I digress. Adjacent to the State of the Union address, there were multiple responses to the State of the Union address. There was Joe Kennedy's response to the State of the Union address. There was Bernie Sanders' response to the State of the Union address. There was Representative Maxine Waters' response to the State of the Union address. And even there was Angela Rye's response to the State of the Union address. I will admit fully that I didn't watch any of these either. Again, in keeping with just not falling into the complete clusterfuck mind trap, excuse my French, of this administration and what it has brought to us in the year 2018, I kind of checked out. And I want to just focus on something a little more apropos to the occasion of the month, which is Black History Month. Now, separate from the State of the Union address, a lot of important things happened in January. But I will say that one thing that came about as a result of the State of the Union address and the responses to it is that everyone immediately started saying, oh, Representative Joe Kennedy could be the next person to run for president. He's what we need. He's the young, fresh blood that we need. You've got other people in the political sphere and an area who are saying that we need Bernie Sanders. You've got diehard people saying that Hillary Clinton should run for president again. Last month, right around the time of MLK Day, which has become sort of an opportunity for people, racists, to troll people of color online about the revised history of the Honorable Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. And so it is fast becoming one of my least favorite social media holidays and occasions. Neither here nor there. One thing that happened in conjunction with what we've seen in everything culminating in the last several years since the coup that has taken over our country in the stolen presidency of Hillary Clinton and her attempted run at the White House. Whether it is the Dr. Larry Nassar problem, whether it is Time's Up, Me Too, you've got this galvanization of women demanding equality, whether it's political, financial, or sort of the autonomy of your body. And so one thing that was really breathtaking and really stopped time was Oprah's acceptance speech at the Cecil B. DeMille, her acceptance speech for the Cecil DeMille Award at the Emmys in January. Now, on this occasion, again, you had many pundits, many people now claiming that Oprah was going to be running for president. That was sort of a contemporary discussion that was happening, and a lot of people felt it was pretty polarizing, one way or the other. And, whether Oprah decides to run for president is beyond me. If she decides that's what she wants to do with her time and her resources, I think it would be fantastic. I think that what we're witnessing in America is such a vacuum and void of leadership from the White House that all Americans are incredibly desperate to find someone to fill that space other than who's currently in charge. Anytime someone breathes on a mic, they're asking them to run for president. And I think that's potentially good, but it's also potentially bad. Now, one thing that Mrs. Oprah Winfrey discussed at length in her speech was that she brought up the timely death of Recy Taylor, who is a very unknown civil rights icon and legend. Shortly after this speech, where we all learned a lot, we were all moved by this speech, I became enamored with another conversation that was happening around the topic of equal pay for women, black women, in entertainment specifically, that has been started by the phenomenal actress and comedian and host, Monique. Now, what I aim to do in this episode, which I'm calling Mo Money, Mo Problems, Monique, is to discuss how all of these things are somewhat interconnected and how we can learn from our black history, and even myself, who thinks of myself as someone who's very well versed in black history, can learn and really perhaps approach our situations and problem solving in 2018 with the lessons of our past. Now, as Black History Month approached, and I had a phone conversation with one of my best friends, Mr. Josh Wilkerson. In this conversation, Josh mentioned the book, At the Dark End of the Street. Now, this is written by Dr. Danielle McGuire. And I will be honest and perfectly honest in telling you that I did not have time to read this book since that conversation, but I did watch a lecture that Dr. McGuire gave at the University of Memphis in 2015, around the time that she was discussing this on a tour. Now, what we realize is that though Martin Luther King is credited as being one of the leaders of the Montgomery Bus Boycott movement, and so is Rosa Parks, there was such a strong undercurrent of black female demand for respect of their autonomy in the South, in the Jim Crow South, in the 50s, that really served as all of the muscle and tears and blood, sweat, and tears of this entire movement. And that's one thing I want to talk about today, how it relates to our protest in 2018, whether it is Monique's demand for $20 million from Netflix, or whether it is for our demand to have fair and equal elections. Now, I do think that it is important to understand the role of black women in black history. I think that I never really realized how often, when we read books that are framed with male protagonists, how often the sweat equity of women, specifically women of color, is completely ignored. And this is something I was totally blind to until I started researching this book. Now, I watched multiple book reviews on, is called At the Dark End of the Street, and also lectures of the author of this book. And this is a white lady now writing about black women and rape culture and the legal and societal change that had to occur in conjunction with our free and unfettered franchise, the Voting Rights Act, the Montgomery Bus Boycott and movement, the everything that was going on in the South was fully present and motivated by black women. And so I would invite you to watch that lecture. I will link it at the bottom. But also read the book if you have time. I will try to read that book as well. But this is something that we need to all learn from. Because one thing I noticed was that on January 24th of this year, Monique called for a boycott of Netflix. Now, the purpose for the call of this boycott was that she mentions in this, I don't know if it was a YouTube or what forum she posted this video, but it was just sort of a straight-to-camera appeal to the masses, where she was asking for people to join with her in a boycott of Netflix because they had offered her only $500,000 to perform a comedy special. And Monique saw this as a slight and an injustice, being that even recently, Netflix, in producing their original content, had actually offered Amy Schumer $11 million to do a comedy special, and then she negotiated that up to $13 million based on the contracts awarded to Chris Rock at $20 million and also Dave Chappelle at north of $20 million for their own comedy specials. Now, again, this is a very niche moment in history. A lot of you will probably be changing the channel at this point because you don't care about Monique, you don't care about equal pay for black women, you don't care about equal pay for black female comedians, and you certainly don't have time to worry about this person's protest. But it is an incredibly important call to action by Monique, and I do want to analyze it through the lens of history today. Now, let's discuss what a boycott is. To me, and this is just sort of a fundamental preconceived notion, with a boycott, there has to be some level of described injustice. It has to be sort of an unequivocal injustice that's taking place. Whether it's inequality based on fear, based on lack of representation. It's a call to change based on something that has not evolved with the times that we find ourselves in typically. That was the case in Montgomery in the 1950s. Now, there has to be an oppressive actor with a boycott. This is who you're boycotting against. In Alabama, it was the bus line. And the bus line's actions as an arbiter and an enforcer of Jim Crow laws as they existed in the 50s. Then there's a whole logistical approach which is somewhat nuanced and magical, and sometimes there is an undercurrent that we never see until much later on. And this involves who the participants are, the timeline of said boycott, the ask or the demand for change. What is the change that we're requesting is going to be different as a result of doing this boycott? And also, you almost always need a sympathetic face to be the front and the, for lack of a better term, mascot of the movement. And in 1955, what we saw was that Rosa Parks was in fact the sympathetic face of this movement. You had this quiet, demure black woman, elderly, bun, with tired feet, who is lauded as the sole beginner of this movement. And the fact is that while Rosa Parks' contributions are incredibly significant, they're almost far more significant in her involvement in what was going on at the time as it regarded the autonomy and the demand for such of black women's bodies. There was a case in Alabama, in a remote town in Alabama, and again, this is something that you'll find out when you follow up on Dr. McGuire and her research, where a black woman, Reese Taylor, was raped, gang raped. And Rosa Parks, young Rosa Parks, was sent as an arm or an employee of the NAACP to take the account of this woman. Now, why is this significant? Because ultimately, at the time, much like we see now with the Black Lives Matter movement and the revolt thereof, you had the police working in tandem with terrorizers who were white men who viciously raped and violated the bodies of black women on a regular basis. This is what happened all the time. Fast forward to the mid 1950s, and this was something that was even more prevalent on the bus lines themselves. You know, we see bus drivers as these sort of friendly extensions of our community. It's like, oh, you have a school bus driver, then you have a public bus driver. But that's not what bus drivers were in the 50s in Alabama. They were effectively another arm of the law. They were armed. They were white men almost exclusively. They were enforcing a racist and sexist law. And the big problem with this is that bus drivers in that time in Alabama and all over the South were brutalizing black women who were, by and large, their number one patrons. So you would have these guys driving this bus. Sometimes they pull over for you, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they splash you with water. There are accounts of these bus drivers and performing incredibly disgusting acts and violations on black women patrons, whether it was flashing them while driving the bus, whether it was forcing them, enforcing the policies that they had to sit in the back of the bus, not allowing them off, kicking them off the bus. And not only arresting black women in the case of, like we saw in the case of Rosa Parks, for not following Jim Crow laws, but also sometimes even murdering black women or black patrons for not obeying the laws and the rules associated with the bus line in Montgomery, Alabama. And so you really do have a profoundly oppressive state of affairs going on. Now, obviously the oppressive actor is white male dominance broadly, but that is distilled down to the bus line itself and the actors, the drivers, the city, governmental structure. All of those things ultimately are the bad actor that we're talking about with regard to the bus boycott. Now, this boycott started on December 5th, 1955 and lasted over a year. It lasted through basically most of December in the following year, 1956, until a federal ruling came down which decided unequivocally that the rules associated with the segregation of the bus line was unconstitutional. Now, logistically, who are the participants of this boycott? You had the black female riders, the daily riders of these buses, namely domestics, but domestics of all ages. You had older black women, you had middle-aged black women, you had young black women, whether they were babysitters, housekeepers, wet nurses, whether they were maids, cooks, whatever the occupation was, there was a specific need and demand for black women to be the patrons of these bus lines, which were the only way to get them from their black communities segregated to the white households where they were working, and often brutalized again by the male, home leaders of the house, whether, you had fathers of babysitting clients who were raping teenage girls. All of these things were happening. And when these things were happening, the police acted as an agent and further extension of that oppression. They never fully documented the accounts of black women or took them seriously. They oftentimes added to the weight of the problems by brutalizing them, raping black women themselves. And then also, if white men who were, again, brutalizing these black women were ever caught, they were never fully brought to justice. And so there is this linkage of, again, the demand for autonomy in black women, who were the number one patrons of these bus lines, to be the driving force of this movement. One, organizing in the churches, organizing and scheduling the carpool as an alternative to using the buses, being the ones who refused to ride the bus even when others didn't. So it is completely timely, and it makes perfect sense that an outspoken and highly recognized voice like Monique would be the one to lead the charge on equal pay in Hollywood. What was the change? The change was that we really needed, there's always going to be racism, effectively. There was always going to be sort of remnants of Jim Crow. But the need for the bus lines themselves to become desegregated, that was the specific ask. And again, we go back to the sympathetic face was Rosa Parks. Not the militant Rosa Parks who worked at the NAACP, who had a record for a really bouted form of activism. It was just this demure, quiet, humble, young black woman, or, at the time she wasn't incredibly young, but, this woman was the face of the movement with tired feet. Not anything associated with rape, culture, that really was the driving force behind this movement. Now, I want to talk about the Monique's call to action specifically. Now, one thing that you realize in 2018 was that Netflix, while it had a lot of representation of black voices, and by black voices I mean you've got media, you've got syndication of other shows, you've got original content being driven not only by black actors and actresses, but also by directors and writers. So The Get Out, Dear White People, you've got Spike Lee's She Gotta Have It, the series. You've got countless independent films being showcased regularly on Netflix. So there was a robust culture environment that supported, black voices within Netflix. And so at the time that Monique's call to boycott Netflix came about, there really hasn't been this feeling that Netflix is this oppressive body, much like the Alabama bus boycott. You've also got a situation where Monique's reasoning for calling on this boycott seems to be about this pay disparity between her and her male counterparts who are black, and also her white female counterparts. But the issue is that Monique's individual career is one that has fluctuated over time. While Monique is celebrated and known for her phenomenal achievements in acting and also comedy, she is inarguably the most decorated living comedian. She was the former host of the BET show, The Monique Show. She was one of the main characters in The Parkers. She also had her own charm school on VH1. That was one of my favorite shows of Monique's. And separate from that, she hosted the BET Awards, and she was the best ever host of the BET Awards. Now, take that aside, you've got her work in Precious, which won her the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress. And I think there is a misalignment of expectations of what that would do for her career. Now, Monique has been very busy on the comedy tour circuit all along, even though that is something that is typically more underground. We don't really know her for that in terms of it being a big appeal. So I think Monique's call to action and what she would like to see changed in the interviews I've seen and in the discussion going around has been this sort of demand for her to get the equal pay of a counterpart like a Dave Chappelle or a Chris Rock. Now, arguably, those two, or you're really comparing apples and oranges. Take the gender out of it. Monique's involvement in the Parkers cannot really be compared to the Dave Chappelle involvement in the creation of the Chappelle Show and the proliferation of the Chappelle Show. They're not really the same. Similarly, with Chris Rock's multiple TV shows and longer career, Everybody Hates Chris is a much different, again, CBS versus UPN, CBS and Comedy Central versus BET. Monique has always had a very strong support within the black community, and so her, and also even in many of the projects that she's done movie-wise have been more independent projects, as opposed to if you compare her to some of her comedy contemporaries, even if you were to rope someone like an Eddie Murphy into this conversation as a black peer, the standard for payment is very different based on the types of deals these people have gotten. Monique's deal that was offered at $500,000 could arguably not be very far off from Monique's typical garnering of pay history. And that has nothing to do other than just the types of jobs she's booked up until this point. Now, one thing when it ropes in Monique and the movement itself, I think the demand for Monique has changed. I think you have an actress and a comedian who, for a very long time, built a brand about uplifting others, whether they were people of color or whether they weren't. The Monique show, Monique developed a huge reputation about just celebrating talent and really being uplifting to everyone she had on her show as a guest. Now, in recent years, since the falling out and the current blackball of Monique, you've seen her rally against many prominent figures in media and also politics. So Tyler Perry, Oprah Winfrey, and also Lee Daniels, the director, who are in concert responsible for much of the quality black content that we get in the world. You know, you might not like Tyler Perry movies, you might not like Oprah as an actress, but there is no denying that for those three people's contributions, they are setting a stage and creating opportunities for people of color in media that didn't exist before, either of them. Tyler Perry runs a huge studio operation in Atlanta that produces movies globally. Thousands of jobs are created by Tyler Perry. You've got the same thing with Oprah Winfrey and the Oprah Winfrey Network. And even before then, you had stories being told on the Oprah Winfrey Show that changed the discussions around race and politics and governance, and even sexism and homophobia and disabilities, music, everything. Pop culture, she is a legend, rightfully so. And Lee Daniels, even to his own credit and right, has been the driving force behind many film projects, but also television. You've got Empire. You've got now Star. Star is one of my favorite shows on television, starring the wonderful and incomparable Queen Latifah. And so it really is a situation where you've got an argument that is rooted in personal beef from one actor, that is Monique. It is very difficult, because of these things, for Monique to be seen as a sympathetic voice or sympathetic face of this movement. I think that Monique perhaps impetuously jumped into the idea of a boycott, and I don't know that that might have been the best approach for this demand in equal pay. Monique has said that she's not necessarily doing this for her own pay, but for others who will come behind her, like a Tiffany Haddish. I would question whether Monique contacted Tiffany Haddish about her quest to support her before waging this war against Netflix. I doubt that that was the case. I think when it comes to blackness, protest, and progress, we have to be mindful of our history and use it as a tool and a guide in guiding our actions and steps when it comes to doing the things and pursuing the things that we want to do. Now, why is this relevant to Black History Month? Why is this relevant to our current politics? I found it sort of unnerving and disheartening that at the time that in the sphere, when people were discussing Oprah Winfrey as a legitimate candidate potentially for the 2020 election to face Donald Trump, one of the greatest threats to the globe, you had this voice of dissent coming based on an argument for a protest against Netflix. And it was rooted much in part against Oprah, against voices in the media like Roland Martin, who have served as truth tellers and Roland Martin is one of the undeniably honest voices when it came to media who was not swayed by the Donald Trump machine. He was not derailed by this phenomenon that took over our politics and our elections. Now, Oprah Winfrey, if she ran for president, I would consider voting for her, absolutely. I would hope that she would run as an independent, not as a member of the Democratic Party. I think that when it comes down to what would be the next best thing for Monique, I think Monique is incredibly successful in discussing this boycott. Part of me wishes that she would put as much effort into promoting this boycott and the call for such as she into her projects, into promoting her projects. One could argue if Monique had taken the effort that she's using and energy that she's exhausting to promote this boycott, which has been an ongoing conversation in television, in online television, via YouTube, via different blogs, the Sway's Universe show, interview. It's been an ongoing thing. So I really hope that you all will follow it. She might not be in this situation now. And I think it is unfortunately a situation where you're seeing a queen of comedy who is somewhat not realizing that she's been dethroned. And she's waging war against people who ultimately are the gatekeepers for Hollywood and television and media. Tyler Perry, Oprah Winfrey, Lee Daniels, and even when it comes to black media, I would argue that Roland Martin is one of the official voices within that movement. So let's talk about Netflix for a while. Whether Netflix is a suppressive force or not. It's hard to argue. Netflix is technology. Most boycotts and most oppressive figures rail against technology. They are groups that turn back the hands of time, turn back rights, reduce access, reduce information. Netflix is kind of the exact opposite of that. Netflix offers a format for people who might not be able to afford cable, who might not be able to have the access and ability to even have high amounts of data at their disposal to really, because of technology, access great content in a very high quality way. 81% of adults between 18 and 35 have a Netflix account. There are 120 million nearly users of Netflix, half of them are American. You've got 58% of users between 25 and 34, internet users now. 58% between 25 and 35 have been users of Netflix. 65% if you look specifically within the 16 to 24 demographic. Why is this important? It's important to understand the profile of the Netflix user to understand whether those people are going to be really and true supporters of someone like a Monique, who in her heyday ultimately worked and amassed a following in the early 2000s as one of the reigning queens of comedy. No one can ever take that honor away from Monique. When it comes to acting, however, her Academy Award win, which I believe was in 2010, don't quote me on that, is again significantly later, but again it's something that people in this younger demographic aren't necessarily going to appreciate. So while you had most of the bus riders that ultimately railed against the system in Birmingham, Alabama, were brutalized by this police force, brutalized by this extension of the police force in bus drivers. They had a reason. They had a bone to pick separate from Rosa Parks. They had a bone to pick separate from all these things. And so it was very much a different atmosphere to get people galvanized against this bus boycott system, where users like me who rely on Netflix for content, rely on Netflix for an understanding of Black history, rely on Netflix to produce content like The Get Out, content like She Gotta Have It, content like Mudbound. Mudbound is a transformative piece, an independent film that wowed Sundance and was bought by Netflix, currently streams on Netflix, features Mary J. Blige. Mary J. Blige was nominated for Golden Globes, and also the Academy Award in both award sets for Best Original Song and also for acting as a supporting actress. Why is this important? Mary J. Blige is a historical figure within the black community. It is very hard to argue that a company giving access on a stage to someone like a Mary J. Blige is now somehow oppressive to someone like a Monique, outside of the culture of Monique's individual blackball, Monique's individual reputation that certainly warrants an adjustment in her pay. We don't need to discuss how much Netflix bought the rights to Mudbound for. Mudbound is directed by a black female actress and black female director, and also the screenplay itself is written by a black person. This story recounts from our perspective a time in history where black war heroes were treated like dirt in America and what it meant. It shows the story of this black family that was relied upon by their white counterparts, who by no virtue other than their skin tone was given a strategic advantage over them financially, and that white family used that to not only exhaust every physical, emotional, and contributorial resource to their shared environment, their shared local economy, but also terrorized and brutalized them. Mudbound is a call for a boycott in and of itself based on the legacy of pay inequity despite talent. But it is hard to argue that the purveyors and the showcasers of a story like Mudbound are the oppressors themselves, as Monique would be claiming now. So I just have those unanswered questions for Monique. I wish her incredibly well in her pursuit. I think Monique is the perfect person to raise the question of pay inequality in Hollywood, despite reputation. But I also think that when it comes to being a sympathetic figure, Monique is no Rosa Parks. Sydney is no Dr. Martin Luther King. And you cannot argue that the synergy between those two characters presents a vilification of black history, black progress, black access to the stage, garnered by legends like Tyler Perry, Oprah Winfrey, Roland Martin, and also Lee Daniels themselves. They are not perfect people. None of them are. Nor were Rosa Parks, nor were Dr. Martin Luther King. But they are all parts of our history. So where does that leave us? I think that many black people, not just Monique, find comfort in seeking a boycott, making a stink. That's not bad. Boycotts are a very effective tool for fighting oppression. But there's a science to boycotts. There's a history behind boycotts. It's not just, I woke up, I'm mad, let's boycott. So what do boycotts require? Boycotts are often, if not always, a last resort to a problem that is systemic and profound, not that of an individual. The sole benefactor of said individual or the group seeking a change, seeking progress, is almost always never the face of said movement. Rosa Parks was downplayed despite her role in advancing the autonomy of black women's bodies and rejection of brutalized violence against black women in the South. She had to be made over to be this demure figure who was just tired one day. They completely negated this entire realm, this entire powerful force behind this movement that led as the organization in order to make it successful. What does that mean for Monique? It means Monique should be a driving force and organizer behind the fight for pay equality for black people, for women, and also for comedians. But maybe it's not about waging her career against Amy Schumer's. Maybe it's not about levying Monique's resume against Dave Chappelle's resume. Maybe it's not about levying Monique's net worth or value against Chris Rock's. I don't think that's her argument. I also don't think that her win is a contract of $20 million from Netflix. I think Monique wins because Monique made noise. The talent is undeniable. Her impact is undeniable. Now, where will this lead? What is her win? What is her exit strategy? That is what we don't know. But we do know that all boycotts have an exit strategy. Boycotts require strategic campaigning, diligent planning. Boycotts require an understanding of all of the elements of the logistics. Who are your participants? What is your timeline? What is the ask demand? What are you hoping for to change? And who is that sympathetic face? Who is that mascot? Now, one other thing about boycotts that is undeniable, whether they are successful or not successful, they all have a lasting cultural impact on our society. In many ways, the 2016 election was a form of a boycott. It is not over. It has been extended in the form of the Women's March of 2017, and then again in January of 2018, where you saw millions of women worldwide leading a charge against brutalization, violence, unequal pay, misogyny, that we all saw unfold and unravel in a very disgusting and ugly way in 2016 and decades before. It's never gone away. What's changed is that now, because of that, in 2018, women have been galvanized to lead a charge politically. Record numbers of women are running for governorships, including in my state of Georgia, where Stacey Abrams and also another white girl named Stacey are running for post of governor. This is somewhat unheard of in this state. And I'd be interested to see where this lands us, where we're going to be in a year because of all of these negative things, all of the voices of dissent, all of the anger and motivation. But I will say what disheartens me and what I want to see improved upon is that there is a huge danger in vilifying a powerful, black supportive voice like Oprah Winfrey for a petty, individual, personal beef, that of Monique. That should not be tolerated. That should not be promoted. That should not be the lasting impact and takeaway culturally from this discussion. I see the seeds being planted to wage a war against someone like an Oprah Winfrey who could be our saving grace in 2020. Just like we saw it with Hillary Clinton and past discussions of things that came up, things that were planted by other black people, whether it was Cornel West, whether it was Killer Mike, whether it was Michelle Alexander, whether it was Ava DuVernay. Again, all brilliant contributors to black history and the black condition in America. All add value. But do we need the voices of dissent to be so loud and clear when it comes to personal choices? I don't think so. So that would be my question to Monique. I hope the best for all of the boycotts. And that has just been my analysis of relating the Montgomery Bus Boycott, which has been long misunderstood, even by myself, and what it means for our current state of affairs. And I say this as a black man who has never been a black woman. I've never been a black woman in the workplace. I've never been a woman in the workplace. I am not the one to question anyone's protest, to question anyone's motives. But I know what I don't want the result to be. And with that, I would like to end this discussion by thanking our friends of the show. If you'd like to become a friend of the show, you can make a contribution to Not On My Watch by donating to www.paypal.me/jkh2. And I will pull up those who I am thanking now. Now, in the month of January, I had a lot of contributions. Many of you were very patient with me, despite the fact that I hadn't been running episodes. But I do want to thank at Laura VF1968, wonderful year to be born if that's your birth year. I'd like to also thank Hillary's My Homegirl on Twitter. I'd like to thank at DebShurer1 of Australia. I'd like to thank, well, she lives in America now, but thank you from way down under. I'd like to thank Murph Doggy. I'd like to thank Elizabeth C. Elizabeth C. has been my champion and my hero throughout all of this. Thank you. I'd like to thank at B Summerland. I'd like to thank Elizabeth W. I'd like to thank at Ms_CB. I'd like to thank Star W. I'd like to thank Michelle M. I would like to thank Rachel S. Also, Allison L. Many names to thank. B Summerland, at B Summerland. Angela W. Another thank you to @_graycat. I'd like to thank Selena W. I'd like to thank Tabania C. I'd like to thank Geraldine T. Elizabeth C. again. At Chaz Redbear, thank you. I'd like to thank Nancy V. Barry G. Albert R. Elizabeth C. and Lissa G. again. Thank you so much for making this show possible. Thank you for tuning in every week, particularly on Thursdays, to watch Not on My Watch. My name is James K. Holder II. It has been a pleasure to serve you in this capacity. I hope you will like, comment, share, and subscribe. I want you to retweet and repeat as always. And lastly but not least, I'd like to invite you to relax, relate, and resist. Thank you.
Too complex, much too complex, too complex, much too complex, too complex, too complex, too complex.